I want to talk about the bee, which is a magnificent insect. Now, the bee colony consists of three members: the queen bee, the worker bees, and the drones. Now, the bee has a complex social structure and it reveals intricate behavioral patterns. Now, when the bees are on the lookout for a new hive, they send out exploratory bees to find a suitable place, where the air is clean, where the temperature is moderate, and the environment is secure. And when the bees come back to report, the bees in authority do not immediately accept the information. They send out another batch of bees to verify that it is really a suitable place. So we see therefore that the behavioral patterns of the bee is evidence-based. Now, the honeycomb inside the beehive is a geometrical masterpiece. It consists of six-sided hexagonal wax cells. It stores the honey and eggs. Now, its design is based on mathematical principles. It's the most economic structure in terms of space and material. Another astonishing feature of the bee is the way the worker bee communicates information to the other bees concerning the location of the food source. So what it does is it performs what we call a waggle dance. And it does this by vibrating the hind portion of his body in a rhythmic fashion. Now, the other bees, they cannot see the dance because it's dark inside the hive, but they can sense they can analyze the dance through special senses and by listening through the rhythmic piping noises of the foraging bee. Now, the bee performs the dance in the form of a figure eight. I'm just going to draw you this figure eight. You can use your imagination. You draw a straight line upwards. This is called the straight run. And you curve to the right or to the left. And you come down and you cross the midpoint of the straight line. Curve upwards again and link up with the bottom part of the straight line to complete the figure eight. Now, the straight run, that's the middle part of the number 8, gives you an idea of the direction of the food source. Now, it doesn't point directly to the food source because the dance is performed on a vertical surface of the honeycomb. So this information is still to be converted to horizontal geography. Now, the bee navigates through using the sun, like many other insects. And this method has two drawbacks. Firstly, sometimes the sun hides behind the clouds and it's obscured. But the bee overcomes this problem by using special sensors, which makes the sun visible even if it's hidden behind the clouds. The second problem with this method using the sun is for navigational purposes is that when the bee returns from the expedition, and sometimes it's trapped inside the hive and hours go by. In other words, the sun's position has changed in the meantime, and the bee has to compensate for this. So what he does is that he slowly rotates the direction of the straight run of the dance, using the straight run as a hour hand of a 24-hour clock. You must remember the bee is aware of the position of the sun at all times using the special sensors. Now for the clever code, and here the figure 8 dance is important. The bees have to decode this figure 8 dance in order to obtain the information of the location of the food source. When the forager returns from the food source, he has the information of the location of the food source. Now, intermediate locations is determined in the following way. When the dance is performed vertically upwards, the food source will be in the direction of the sun. When the dance is performed in a vertical way downwards, then the food source is in the opposite direction of the sun. Say for example, the food source is 50 degrees to the left of the position of the sun. So what he does is he performs a figure 8 dance on the vertical surface of the honeycomb, so that he orientates his body in such a way that it makes an angle of 50 degrees with the imaginary vertical line. So in other words, now if the other bees take off, they take off in a straight line which coincides with the angle of the forager. Other positions is determined in a similar way. We've spoken about the direction of the food source. How do the bees determine the distance of the food source? So what happens is, if the food source is near the hive, what happens when the bee returns from his expedition? He's still fresh and energetic, and his dance will be intense. On the other hand, if the food source is very distant from the hive, when the bee returns with his cargo, he's tired and exhausted, and you find the bee will move around in a very lazy, lethargic way. So you see, it's not difficult to remember how the bees locate the distance of the food source. With this background information, we can now proceed to the Quran and hear what it has to say about the bee. And this is laid out in chapter 16, verse 66, 67, 68, and 69. Consider how thy sustainer has inspired the bee. Build ourselves hives in the hills and trees and human habitations, and assimilate of all the fruits, and humbly follow the pathways ordained by thy sustainer. And lo, there issues from their digestive organs concealed in the abdomen a beverage of many colors, in which there is a healing for man. Surely in all of this is a sign or a message for those who are willing to listen. Now let's analyze the verse with this background understanding that we have. It first says, consider how thy sustainer. It doesn't say God or Allah, and there's a reason for that. One of the meanings of Lord or Rabb in the Quran is the evolver, which means this ingenious bee system has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. Today there's a separate species of bees which reveal primitive characteristics. It is conceivable that the ancient traits of these bees may resemble those of the ancestors of the modern bee. This supports the idea that the complex behavior of the modern bee is a product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Now the next important phrase is that of inspired the bee. This system of locating the food and its other magnificent capabilities were programmed by the divine. It is God that has guided the bee through the ages and allowing it to acquire such magnificent skills. And this all happened through the evolutionary laws and processes created by God. The next part of the verse is, build thyself hives in the hills and trees and human habitations. So the Creator instructs the bee through his natural laws where to find the best suitable place, and that is in a place where it's least polluted, fresh and secured. And the next phrase is, and assimilate of all the fruits. Now some people see a problem with this because they say the bee mostly eat pollen and nectar and not fruit, but they haven't actually looked at the scientific definition of a fruit. A fruit is actually the edible seed or the ripened ovary, and it contains structures that produce nectar, and there's pollen also in that area of the flower. So the Quran is therefore perfectly correct in its wording. The fourth phrase is, and humbly follow the pathways ordained by the Lord. And this refers to the navigational skills of the bee, which include how the food is located, again under divine guidance. The exclamation "lo" indicates a sudden change in the tone of the discussion without a break in the continuity of the conversation. The production of honey involves the amazing transformation of the ingested food material to this wonderful substance, and this happens in the digestive organs of the alimentary tract and includes the pharyngeal glands, which is situated in the throat, so to speak, of the bee. The next part of the verse refers to the healing properties of honey. So the Quran does not restrict the benefits of the bee to the healing properties of honey. It appeals to us to reflect on the lifestyle of the bee. So if you study the bee colony is a symbol of industry and cooperation. As I said earlier, there are three principal members in the bee colony. The queen bee, which lays the eggs, the male drones, which have a productive function, and the worker bees. Now, the worker bees, they spend their time tirelessly looking for food such as nectar and pollen. Now, you see therefore that each of these bees have their particular functions, and in other words, there's division of labor. And this creates an efficient system. Now, let's concentrate on the female worker bee. Note that the Quran refers to the worker bee in the female gender, and this was something that was only recently discovered. So when the worker bee returns from the food source, it consumes just enough for material to satisfy its own needs, and the rest it contributes to the remainder of the colony. In the hive, it keeps the hive clean, keeps it at the right temperature, nurses the young, and very importantly, protects the hive against danger. When the hive is threatened, it uses its defense mechanism, that's stinging, and in the process it dies. What we can learn from this as humans, if we don't have a cause for which we are prepared to die for, then we have no real purpose in life. Now, most of these ailments, these human diseases, can be alleviated or reduced by observing the lifestyle or the way the bee operates. Finally, the bee plays a crucial role in our economy. You find that the bee, it is said that if the bee should become extinct, our economy would collapse. You can think about the pollination, which will grind to a halt, and the bee industry itself will collapse. And the bee does all this for no compensation. The Quran appropriately calls the bee a divine gift.